You have had the experience. Everyone has had the experience. A feeling arrives unbidden, unexplained, without any identifiable source that tells you something before your rational mind has any basis for the knowing. A conviction that the person walking toward you is not to be trusted, even though you have never met them and they have done nothing observable to warrant the suspicion. A sense that you should take a different route home tonight, for no reason you can articulate, even though the usual route is perfectly convenient. A knowing that something is wrong with a loved one before the phone call arrives with the news. A sudden certainty that the investment you are about to make is a mistake, not because of anything you can identify in the documents you have reviewed, but because of a feeling that rises unbidden and refuses to be argued away. An inexplicable reluctance to board a plane, a train, a car, a reluctance that a small number of people have reported experiencing before disasters that they narrowly avoided by following the reluctance. A sense of recognition when you meet someone for the first time, a feeling that you already know this person, that something about them is familiar, that the meeting is somehow significant. A pull toward a particular decision, a particular opportunity, a particular person, that does not come from any deliberation you have performed, but that arrives complete and certain, demanding your attention, insisting on its own authority. You call it a gut feeling, intuition, a sixth sense, a hunch. The words we use for it are all vague and approximate, because the phenomenon resists the categories that our rational culture has developed for describing knowledge. Knowledge, in the dominant Western framework, is supposed to come from evidence, from observation, from reasoning, from the systematic processing of sensory data into propositional claims that can be tested, defended, and justified. Intuition does none of these things. Intuition does not present its evidence. It does not show its reasoning. It does not make its case. It simply arrives certain, immediate, and often correct, and demands to be trusted or dismissed based on no criteria that the rational mind can evaluate. For most of human history, intuition was respected as a genuine source of knowledge. Hunters depended on it to track prey. Healers relied on it to diagnose illness. Leaders consulted it to make decisions that affected entire communities. Mystics cultivated it as a mode of perception that complemented and, at certain moments, exceeded the capacities of ordinary sense. The Greeks had a word for it, nous, the direct intellectual perception of truth that differed from discursive reasoning. The medieval scholastics distinguished between ratio, reasoning, and intellectus, intuitive understanding, treating both as legitimate cognitive faculties. Aquinas, in particular, argued that intellectus, the direct intuitive grasp of truth, was the higher faculty, the one that human reason aspired toward and that angels possessed in their pure form. Reasoning was necessary for beings like humans whose intellectual faculties were embodied and limited, but reasoning was a path toward the intuitive insight that represented knowledge in its most perfect form, treating both as legitimate cognitive faculties. Islamic philosophers developed elaborate theories of dahag, taste, the immediate, experiential knowledge that transcended conceptual analysis. The Sanskrit word prajna referred to the direct wisdom that arose from sustained contemplative practice, and indigenous traditions around the world built their epistemologies around the assumption that direct, non-discursive knowing was not merely possible but essential to human flourishing. The Christian tradition of discernment, the capacity to distinguish authentic spiritual movements from false ones, treated intuitive knowing as a gift of the Holy Spirit, cultivated through prayer and refined through practice. Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises, composed in the 16th century, include detailed instructions for the discernment of spirits, a systematic methodology for developing the intuitive capacity to recognize which internal impulses are trustworthy and which are to be resisted. The Sufi masters of Islam developed al-qalb, knowledge of the heart, as a distinct mode of cognition that operated through a spiritual organ that the rational mind could neither access nor replicate. And the contemplative schools of Buddhism and Hinduism cultivated prajna and antarjnana, respectively, as direct, non-discursive modes of perception that became available through sustained meditation practice. Then came the Enlightenment, and with the Enlightenment came the systematic marginalization of intuition as a legitimate source of knowledge. Descartes built his philosophy on the foundation of methodical doubt, the principled rejection of every belief that could not be defended by clear and distinct reasoning. Bacon articulated the inductive method that would become the foundation of empirical science. Hume reduced knowledge to sense impressions and their associations. Kant, for all his brilliance, restricted the domain of legitimate knowledge to what could be synthesized through the categories of the understanding. And the cumulative effect of these intellectual developments was to push intuition to the margins of respectable discourse, to treat it as a relic of pre-modern superstition, as a poorly understood cognitive shortcut, as a species of guessing that might occasionally produce correct results by chance, but that could never rise to the level of genuine knowledge. The scientific and philosophical consensus of the 20th century reinforced this marginalization. Psychology in its behaviorist phase dismissed inner experience entirely, treating introspective reports as scientifically worthless. Cognitive psychology, in its dominant modes, treated intuition as a collection of heuristics and biases, cognitive shortcuts that sometimes worked, but that more often produced systematic errors. Daniel Kahneman's celebrated work on System 1 and System 2 thinking, which won him the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics, has often been interpreted as showing that intuition is the problem rather than the solution. That our fast, intuitive judgments are systematically biased, and that rational deliberation is the corrective that protects us from the distortions of intuitive processing. The cultural message, amplified through popular science writing, was clear. Do not trust your gut is wrong, use your head. And the pendulum swung so far in this direction that the contemplative and religious traditions that had cultivated intuition as a genuine cognitive capacity were dismissed along with the capacity itself. What the Christian mystics called discernment, what the Sufis called al-qalb, what the Buddhist tradition called prajna, these became objects of historical or anthropological curiosity, rather than living practices whose insights might illuminate the nature of mind. The reduction of cognition to deliberate analysis was not merely a scientific position. It was a cultural stance that excluded from consideration the accumulated wisdom of every major contemplative tradition in human history. But this message is partial, and in important respects it is false. The full picture of intuition that has emerged from neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and the physics of non-local information processing tells a different story, a story in which intuition is not a relic to be overcome, but a sophisticated mode of cognition that operates through mechanisms distinct from conscious reasoning, and that, in specific domains and under specific conditions, performs better than deliberate analysis. The rehabilitation of intuition is one of the most important but least publicized developments in the cognitive sciences of the last 3 decades. And when combined with the quantum mechanical perspectives on non-local information that we have explored across these investigations, it points toward a picture of human cognition that restores intuition to the status it held in most human cultures throughout most of human history. A legitimate, reliable, and in some domains indispensable form of knowing. The first revolution in the scientific understanding of intuition came from an unexpected source, the neuroscience of the gut. For most of medical history, the digestive system was treated as a passive tube through which food passed, and from which nutrients were extracted. The gut, in this framework, was a plumbing system, a biological infrastructure that supported the real cognitive work performed by the brain, but that had no cognitive significance of its own. This framework collapsed in the late 20th century when neuroscientists began to map the enteric nervous system, the vast network of neurons that lines the human gastrointestinal tract from esophagus to rectum. The term second brain is not metaphorical. The enteric nervous system is a genuine neural network with its own neurons, its own neurotransmitters, its own glial cells, its own capacity for learning and memory, and its own ability to function autonomously from the central nervous system. If you severed the vagus nerve connecting the gut to the brain, the gut would continue to function. It would digest food, respond to threats, coordinate its own activities, maintain its own internal regulation. The central nervous system could not do the same if disconnected from the autonomic systems that the gut helps to coordinate. The gut is not dependent on the brain. The gut is cognitively self-sufficient within its domain. The enteric nervous system contains approximately 500 million neurons, more than the spinal cord, more than any peripheral nervous system, more than the brain of a cat. The neurons are organized into complex networks that process information, produce behaviors, peristalsis, secretion, absorption, and respond to internal and external stimuli with sophistication that rivals, in some respects, the information processing of the central nervous system itself. Michael Gershon, a neuroscientist at Columbia University whose 1998 book, The Second Brain, brought the enteric nervous system to popular attention, has spent his career documenting the cognitive capacities of the gut. The gut makes its own decisions. The gut produces its own neurotransmitters, including approximately 90% of the body's serotonin and 50% of the body's dopamine. The gut maintains its own memory, adjusts its own behaviors based on experience, and communicates with the brain through the vagus nerve in bidirectional conversation that proceeds largely outside of conscious awareness. The vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, the longest nerve in the autonomic nervous system, carries approximately 80% of its information from the gut to the brain and only 20% in the reverse direction. The gut is not taking orders from the brain. The gut is sending information to the brain. Information about digestive status, immune status, microbial composition, emotional tone, and more. Stephen Porges, a neuroscientist at Indiana University, whose polyvagal theory has reshaped the understanding of the autonomic nervous system, has documented the extensive role of the vagus nerve in social perception, emotional regulation, and the rapid assessment of safety and danger. The vagus nerve is not merely a pipeline for digestive information. It is a sophisticated sensory apparatus that monitors internal bodily states, external social cues, and subtle environmental information, integrating these streams of data into the felt sense of safety or threat that we register as gut feeling. When you meet someone and feel immediately comfortable or immediately uncomfortable, the feeling is not produced by conscious deliberation about the person. It is produced by the vagus nerve's rapid, preconscious assessment of the person's facial expressions, vocal tones, postures, and subtle physiological signals. And the assessment arrives in consciousness as a feeling, a gut feeling that carries the integrated verdict of the vagus nerve's evaluation. And the information arrives in the brain not as explicit propositional content but as felt sensations, the gut feelings that give intuition its most common name. When you feel a twist in your stomach about a decision, the twist is not metaphorical. It is a specific physiological event produced by the enteric nervous system in response to information it is processing, transmitted to the brain through the vagus nerve, and registered in consciousness as the distinctive feeling that you interpret as intuitive warning or intuitive approval. The microbiome adds another dimension. The human gut contains approximately 30 trillion bacterial cells, roughly equal to the number of human cells in the entire body. And these bacteria form a dynamic ecosystem that influences mood, cognition, immune function, and behavior through chemical signals transmitted to the enteric nervous system, and, from there, to the brain. The gut microbiome is not merely along for the ride, it is an active participant in the cognitive life of the organism. Research on the vagus nerve's role in microbiome-to-brain communication has established that severing the vagus nerve eliminates many of the behavioral effects produced by specific bacterial strains, indicating that the vagus nerve is the primary conduit through which microbial information reaches the brain. When the signal is intercepted, the influence disappears. When the signal is intact, the microbiome shapes cognition, emotion, and behavior through continuous bottom-up communication that operates entirely outside conscious awareness. And the cognitive influence of the microbiome extends to specific behaviors and emotional states that human beings experience as their own anxiety, depression, cravings, preferences, even specific cognitive styles that correlate with specific microbial communities. The gut feelings that arrive in your consciousness are, in part, the voice of an ecosystem, the integrated output of trillions of microbial cells communicating with the hundreds of millions of neurons in the enteric nervous system and transmitting their integrated signal to the brain through the vagus nerve. Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist at the University of Southern California, whose decades of research on the neural basis of emotion have reshaped the cognitive sciences, who has developed what he calls the somatic marker hypothesis to explain how bodily information participates in decision-making. The somatic marker hypothesis proposes that specific bodily states, gut sensations, heart rate changes, muscle tensions, skin conductance shifts become associated over time with specific outcomes of specific kinds of decisions. When a similar decision arises in the future, the body generates the associated somatic marker before the conscious mind has completed its deliberation, and the somatic marker influences the decision by biasing the conscious mind toward or away from specific choices. The bodily intelligence is not separate from the rational intelligence. It is integrated with the rational intelligence, providing a rapid, pre-conscious, evaluative signal that shapes the conscious decision-making process from below. Damasio's research has included patients with specific neurological damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain that integrates bodily signals with cognitive deliberation. The most famous case in Damasio's research is a patient named Elliot, a successful businessman who, after surgery to remove a brain tumor, retained all his intellectual capacities but lost the ability to make effective decisions. Elliot could discuss investment strategies with sophistication. He could analyze business problems with clarity. He could reason about hypothetical situations with precision. But in his actual life, he made catastrophic choices, bad investments, destructive business partnerships, decisions that any rational analysis would have rejected but that Elliot approved. He had lost nothing of his reasoning capacity. What he had lost was the connection between his reasoning and the bodily signals that normally inform it. Without the somatic markers, his reasoning floated free of the embodied wisdom that normally anchors effective judgment. The result was that his life unraveled not because he could not think, but because he could no longer feel his way toward wise thinking. Damasio's insight connects to findings we have encountered across these investigations. Libet's research established that neural activity preceding conscious decisions begins hundreds of milliseconds before conscious awareness. Haynes extended the predictive window to 7 to 10 seconds. The pattern is clear. The brain makes decisions, initiates actions, and processes information at levels that operate before and below conscious awareness. What arrives in consciousness is the product of extensive processing that has already occurred, and the feelings we call intuitions are the felt quality of that preconscious processing, the summary verdict that the subconscious processing has delivered, arriving in consciousness as a gut feeling, a hunch, an immediate conviction that is not the product of deliberation, but the output of the processing that precedes deliberation. The connection to aging, cardiac coherence, and the other somatic dimensions of cognition we have explored becomes significant here. Bodily wisdom is real. The body processes information. The body delivers verdicts. And the consciousness that lives in the body is informed, continuously and below awareness, by the body's ongoing cognitive activity. These patients retain full cognitive capacity. They can reason, they can calculate, they can analyze, but they cannot make good decisions. Without access to the somatic markers that normally inform their choices, they deliberate endlessly without reaching conclusions, or they reach conclusions that are objectively poor, choosing options that they can justify rationally, but that produce catastrophic outcomes in their actual lives. The patients demonstrate that pure reason, detached from bodily intuition, is not sufficient for effective decision-making. The body's contribution is necessary. Intuition is not an inferior form of reasoning. It is a distinct form of cognition that integrates with reasoning to produce the full capacity for effective judgment. The rehabilitation of intuition in decision research has been advanced by Gary Klein, a cognitive psychologist who has spent decades studying how experts make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, time pressure, and incomplete information. Klein's research on firefighters, military commanders, nurses, and other professionals who must make high-stakes decisions quickly has produced a model he calls recognition, primed decision-making, a framework in which expert decisions are made not through deliberate comparison of alternatives, but through rapid pattern recognition. The expert recognizes the situation as similar to situations previously encountered, retrieves the response that worked in similar situations, and executes the response all within seconds, and all without conscious deliberation. Klein's most famous case involves an experienced firefighter who led his crew into a burning house. Moments after entering, the firefighter had a sudden, overwhelming sense that something was wrong. He could not articulate what. He did not see specific evidence of danger, but he ordered his crew out of the house immediately. Seconds after they exited, the floor they had been standing on collapsed into a basement fire that had been invisible from the ground floor. The case became one of the most cited examples in the literature on expert decision-making because it illustrated something that the deliberate analysis framework could not accommodate. The decision was correct, it was made in time, and it was made without conscious access to the evidence that justified it. When Klein interviewed the firefighter afterward, asking him how he had known to evacuate, the firefighter initially insisted that he did not know. He just had a feeling. Eventually, through careful questioning, Klein was able to reconstruct the subtle environmental cues that the firefighter's unconscious pattern recognition had integrated: the unusual heat distribution, the specific smoke behavior, the sound of the fire, but the firefighter himself had no conscious access to these cues during the event. His conscious mind registered only the feeling. The feeling was the output. The sophisticated integration of multiple weak cues had occurred entirely below the threshold of awareness. The firefighter had sensed the danger without knowing how. His decades of experience had trained his pattern recognition systems to detect subtle anomalies, the lack of expected heat radiating from certain surfaces, the specific sound the fire was making, the way the smoke was behaving, that his conscious mind had not registered, but that his intuitive processing had integrated into a clear, urgent signal. Get out. The intuition saved his crew. The conscious mind could not have produced the decision fast enough. The intuitive mind produced it in time, based on pattern recognition that operated entirely outside conscious awareness, but that proved more reliable than any deliberate analysis the firefighter could have performed. Gerd Gigerenzer, a cognitive psychologist at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, has extended this research into the broader domain of decision-making under uncertainty. Gigerenzer's work challenges the dominant heuristics and biases framework of Kahneman and Tversky by arguing that heuristics are not systematically biased shortcuts that produce errors. They are fast and frugal decision procedures that, in the environments for which they evolved, produce decisions as accurate as, or more accurate than those produced by deliberate analysis. The gaze heuristic used by baseball outfielders to catch fly balls, maintaining the angle of gaze so that it remains constant while running, produces correct trajectories without any of the complex physics calculations that a conscious analysis would require. The take the best heuristic used by people making decisions with incomplete information, evaluating options based on the single most discriminating cue, often outperforms more complex decision procedures that attempt to integrate all available information. Gigerenzer's research has documented dozens of specific heuristics that operate this way. The recognition heuristic, deciding among options based on which one you recognize reliably, outperforms more complex decision procedures in specific domains like investment selection and sports prediction. The one-reason decision-making heuristic, basing a decision on the single most important cue while ignoring all others, often produces better outcomes than decisions that try to integrate multiple cues, because the additional information adds noise rather than signal. The hiatus heuristic used by managers to predict customer behavior, treating customers as active if they have purchased recently and inactive, otherwise outperforms sophisticated statistical models that attempt to integrate detailed purchasing histories. In each case, the heuristic wins, not despite its simplicity, but because of its simplicity, because it matches the relevant structure of the environment without overfitting to noise that more complex methods would incorporate. Intuition, in Gigerenzer's framework, is not a flawed approximation of rational analysis. It is a sophisticated cognitive strategy adapted to specific environmental conditions and often superior to deliberate analysis in the conditions for which it evolved. The convergent message from Damasio, Klein, and Gigerenzer is that intuition is a genuine form of cognition, not a primitive precursor of rational analysis, but a parallel cognitive system with its own distinctive strengths. Intuition is fast. Intuition integrates vast amounts of information below the threshold of conscious awareness. Intuition draws on embodied experience in ways that disembodied reasoning cannot replicate. And intuition, in the right conditions, performs better than deliberate analysis. The research extends beyond individual decision-making into organizational and creative contexts. Philip Goldberg's research on intuition in business settings has documented that executives who rely on intuition in combination with analytical reasoning produce better outcomes than executives who rely exclusively on analysis. Western Agor's surveys of business leaders found that top-performing executives across industries reported higher use of intuition than lower-performing executives, a finding that has been replicated in multiple studies across multiple domains, and research on scientific creativity conducted by sociologist of science Rosalind Westcott and others has documented that major scientific breakthroughs typically involve moments of intuitive insight that precede and guide the subsequent analytical work that establishes the discovery. Einstein, Poincaré, Kekulé, Tesla, and many other major scientific figures have explicitly credited intuition as the source of their breakthrough insights, with analytical reasoning playing the subsequent role of verifying and elaborating what intuition had already delivered. The rehabilitation of intuition in cognitive science is not a return to pre-scientific mysticism. It is a scientifically grounded recognition that the human cognitive system is more sophisticated, more distributed, and more multi-layered than the Cartesian model of the rational thinking subject ever allowed. The HeartMath Institute has added a further dimension to the neuroscience of intuition through its research on the cognitive capacities of the heart. The heart contains approximately 40,000 neurons, a number that qualifies as a small but genuine neural network. And these neurons process information, generate memory, and communicate with the brain through neural, hormonal, and electromagnetic pathways. Roland McCraty and his colleagues at HeartMath have conducted a series of experiments demonstrating that the heart responds to emotionally significant stimuli before the brain does the heart's electrical activity shifts in. Characteristic patterns before images are even shown to subjects, suggesting that the heart is receiving information about upcoming stimuli through channels that the conventional sensory pathways cannot account for. In one series of experiments, subjects were connected to equipment that measured their heart rate variability, electroencephalograms, and other physiological markers. They were then shown a randomized series of images, some emotionally neutral, some emotionally charged, violent, erotic, or otherwise significant. The order of the images was determined randomly by a computer algorithm so that neither the experimenters nor the subjects could know in advance which image would appear next. The results, which have been replicated across multiple laboratories, show that physiological responses, particularly in the heart, begin several seconds before the emotionally charged images appear. The body knows what is coming before it arrives. The heart responds to information that has not yet been received through any conventional channel, and the effect is statistically robust, not a matter of occasional coincidence, but a reliable, measurable phenomenon that challenges the conventional understanding of how information flows through time. Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1978, and who is considered one of the founders of cognitive science, defined intuition in a way that captures the cognitive scientific consensus. The situation has provided a cue. This cue has given the expert access to information stored in memory, and the information provides the answer. Intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition. Simon's definition captures a great deal about how expert intuition works, but it does not capture everything. Because some forms of intuitive knowing deliver information that cannot be attributed to memory, to recognition, or to any prior experience that the intuitive knower could have had. But the story does not end with the cognitive sciences. Because some of the most striking phenomena of intuitive knowing, the presentiment of events before they occur, the knowing of information that the knower has had no conventional access to, the synchronistic alignments of inner impression and outer event cannot be accounted for by the enteric nervous system, the somatic marker hypothesis, or the pattern recognition of expert decision makers. These phenomena point towards something more, something that the conventional cognitive sciences are not equipped to explain, but that the quantum mechanical perspective we have assembled across these investigations may be uniquely positioned to address. Consider the phenomena that the cognitive sciences cannot fully account for. A woman wakes in the middle of the night with a sudden, overwhelming certainty that something has happened to her son. She cannot explain the feeling. She calls him. There is no answer. She calls again. Still no answer. She flies across the country to his city, arriving the next morning to discover that he had been in a serious car accident the previous night at approximately the time she woke up. The timing is specific. The emotional impact was immediate, and the feeling arrived with information that the woman could not have accessed through any conventional channel of perception. The mother's conviction was so strong that she acted on it without hesitation, disregarding the expense of a last-minute cross-country flight and the possibility that she would arrive to find nothing wrong. The knowing was not a hunch she could dismiss. It was an imperative, an internal directive that demanded compliance, and that proved, when she arrived, to have been delivering accurate information through channels that no available neuroscience can explain. Cases like this are dismissed by the skeptical tradition as selection bias, the tendency to remember the intuitions that turned out to be correct and to forget the ones that did not. The dismissal has some force. We do remember the hits and forget the misses, and the statistical base rate of something bad happening to a loved one at some point is high enough that any person having frequent worries will eventually have one that coincides with an actual event. But the explanation does not cover all the cases. Some intuitive knowings are too specific, too precisely timed, too free of prior worry to be attributed to the statistical mechanics of selective memory. Some intuitive knowings include specific content that cannot be reduced to worry or selection bias. A pilot decides at the last moment not to take the flight he was scheduled to operate. The flight crashes, killing everyone aboard. A mother insists her child not attend a particular event. The event becomes the scene of a tragedy she could not have predicted through any rational process. Dean Radin, a researcher at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, has collected and catalogued hundreds of such cases in his books The Conscious Universe and Entangled Minds, establishing that the phenomenon is not isolated or anecdotal, but represents a consistent pattern across cultures and centuries. The cases, taken individually, can always be dismissed as coincidence. The pattern, taken collectively, is harder to dismiss and demands explanation that the conventional cognitive sciences have struggled to provide. And when we examine these cases systematically, when we bring them into the laboratory and test them under controlled conditions, something interesting happens. And the second part of this investigation will take us there. The presentiment experiments are the place where conventional cognitive science runs out of explanation. The phenomenon is reproducible. The methodology is rigorous. The statistical evidence is solid. And the results that the body responds to information about events that have not yet occurred violate every conventional assumption about how information flows through time. The experiments have been conducted in multiple laboratories by multiple researchers over multiple decades, and the core finding has held up under sustained scrutiny. Something is happening. The conventional sciences do not know what. And the question of what could be happening leads directly into the quantum mechanical perspectives that we have assembled across these investigations, because the quantum framework, unlike the classical framework of conventional neuroscience, does not treat the temporal ordering of cause and effect as absolute, and does not treat information as bound to the specific location of its apparent source. Dean Radin, whose research we encountered at the end of the first part of this investigation, has been the most persistent and methodical investigator of what he calls presentiment, the experimental phenomenon in which physiological responses precede the stimuli that produce them. Radin's basic experimental paradigm is elegant and repeatable. A subject sits connected to equipment that measures heart rate variability, skin conductance, electroencephalogram, and other physiological markers. The subject views a screen on which images will be presented at regular intervals. Before each image appears, a randomization algorithm selects from a pool of images some emotionally neutral landscapes, household objects, geometric patterns, some emotionally charged, violent, erotic, or otherwise emotionally significant. The selection is made by the algorithm in real time, immediately before the image is displayed. Neither the experimenter nor the subject knows in advance which image will appear. The physiological responses of the subject are measured not only during and after the image presentation, but also in the seconds before the image appears, and across multiple experiments conducted in multiple laboratories with thousands of trials, a consistent pattern emerges. The subject's physiological responses begin to differentiate several seconds before the emotionally charged images appear. The body starts responding to the emotional content of the upcoming image before the image has been selected by the computer. The heart rate variability, the skin conductance, the electroencephalographic signatures, all of them show the signature of emotional engagement, beginning 2 to 4 seconds before the emotionally charged image is displayed, and the differentiation is statistically significant across the aggregated data, even though no individual trial shows a dramatic effect. The pre-stimulus response cannot be explained by any conventional mechanism. The subject cannot anticipate the image because the image has not been selected when the physiological response begins. The experimenter cannot be cueing the subject because the experimenter does not know which image will be selected. The randomization is controlled by algorithms that are themselves unpredictable to everyone involved. And the bodily response is specifically differentiated. It matches the emotional content of the image that will be displayed, not the emotional content of some arbitrary other image. The body is responding to specific information about a specific future event that has not yet been determined at the moment the response begins. The first wave of experiments was performed by Radin in the 1990s, but the finding has been replicated by independent researchers working in different laboratories. Julia Mossbridge at Northwestern University conducted a meta-analysis in 2012 that examined 26 studies of presentiment and related phenomena. The analysis found a combined effect size that was small but statistically significant, consistent enough across studies to rule out chance, methodological error, or publication bias as full explanations. The effect sizes in these experiments are small in absolute terms, typically corresponding to probability values in the range of 0.01 to 0.001, which is to say statistical significance, but not dramatic physiological differences that would be obvious to casual observation. But the consistency of the effect across studies is striking. Dick Bierman and Stephen Schulte at the University of Amsterdam conducted brain imaging studies of the presentiment effect in 2002, using functional MRI to document that specific brain regions, including the amygdala and the insula, activated several seconds before emotionally charged stimuli were presented, with the activation patterns differentiating between types of upcoming stimuli in ways that match the eventual content of the stimuli. The brain itself, not just the peripheral physiology, appears to register information about upcoming events before those events occur. The presentiment effect is real, the science establishes that it is real, and the explanation remains open. One approach to the explanation invokes the retrocausal interpretations of quantum mechanics. In the standard formulation of quantum mechanics, the future is not causally efficacious. Causes precede effects, and information flows from past to future, but not from future to past. However, certain interpretations of quantum mechanics and certain experimental results challenge this temporal unidirectionality. The transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, developed by John Kramer at the University of Washington, proposes that quantum events involve a handshake between the past and the future, an offer wave moving forward in time, and a confirmation wave moving backward in time, meeting in the middle to produce the definite outcome. In this interpretation, the present is influenced by the future as much as by the past, and the presentiment effect is a biological manifestation of an underlying quantum process in which information from future events is already available to present physiological systems. Kramer's transactional interpretation resolves several long-standing interpretive puzzles in quantum mechanics by treating the quantum event as a completed transaction between emitter and absorber rather than as a one-way propagation from past to future. In Kramer's picture, when an electron emits a photon, the emission involves both a forward-traveling offer wave from the emitter to the absorber and a backward-traveling confirmation wave from the absorber to the emitter. The two waves interact in a handshake that, when completed, produces the definite photon event. The backward-traveling wave is not metaphorical. It is a specific mathematical object in the interpretation, derived from the time-reverse solutions of the quantum wave equation that are typically treated as unphysical in standard formulations, but that Kramer gives physical interpretation. The retrocausal interpretation connects to a specific feature of quantum mechanics that has been experimentally established, the delayed choice experiment. Originally proposed by John Wheeler and subsequently implemented in the laboratory, the delayed choice experiment demonstrates that the choice of how to measure a photon can influence what the photon was doing at an earlier moment. The measurement choice, made in the present, apparently reaches back in time to determine the photon's earlier behavior. The delayed choice experiment does not prove retrocausality in a philosophically uncontroversial sense, but it does demonstrate that the simple picture of causes preceding effects does not apply straightforwardly to quantum systems. The delayed choice experiment has been refined in multiple versions since Wheeler's original proposal. In its most striking form, implemented experimentally by Yoonho Kim and colleagues in 2000, the delayed choice experiment demonstrates that the measurement choice can be made after the photon has apparently completed its journey, and yet the choice still appears to determine what the photon did during its journey. The experimental result does not prove that the future reaches back into the past in a common-sense way, but it does demonstrate that the quantum description of the photon's behavior cannot be given in terms of a definite history that preceded the measurement. The history is, in some sense, co-determined by the measurement present and past in a relationship that classical physics cannot accommodate. The quantum world does not respect the temporal directionality that classical physics assumed, and if biological systems, especially the information processing systems of the heart and the enteric nervous system, operate in part through quantum mechanisms, then they may have access to information about the future in ways that classical biological systems cannot. The non-locality of quantum mechanics provides another framework for understanding intuition. The Bell inequalities, formulated by John Stuart Bell in 1964 and experimentally violated many times since, establish that the correlations between entangled quantum particles cannot be explained by any local hidden variable theory. Entangled particles remain correlated across arbitrary distances, correlations that, whatever their ultimate explanation, involve information connections that do not respect the spatial separations that classical physics takes as fundamental. Bell tests have now been conducted under conditions that close every major loophole that might have allowed classical explanations. Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna, Ronald Hansen at Delft University of Technology, and multiple other research groups have performed Bell tests with entangled photons separated by distances of kilometers, using quantum random number generators to determine measurement settings in real time, and using detection efficiencies high enough to eliminate the detection loophole. The results all confirm the violation of the Bell inequalities. The correlations between entangled particles cannot be explained by any theory in which the particles carry predetermined local properties. The non-locality is established. The Global Consciousness Project, operated by Roger Nelson at Princeton University's Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, until its closure in 2007, and continuing subsequently as an independent initiative, has extended these investigations into the realm of collective consciousness. The project deployed a network of hardware random number generators at sites around the world, continuously generating random output, and analyzed the output for statistical anomalies correlated with major global events. The hypothesis tested was that moments of heightened collective attention or emotion would produce measurable deviations from randomness in the generators, indicating that collective consciousness can influence the physical behavior of random systems. Across more than 500 predefined events over more than 2 decades, the aggregated data showed statistical deviations that the project's analysts argued were unlikely to be due to chance. Critics have contested the methodology and the conclusions. But the pattern that attention matters, that consciousness participates in the physical world, that collective intentional states correlate with physical anomalies, is consistent with the broader framework in which intuition is one manifestation of the deeper connections between mind and matter that quantum mechanics hints at and that classical physics excluded. The phenomenon has been investigated also in twin studies, where pairs of identical twins have sometimes reported simultaneous emotional or physical experiences separated by significant geographic distances. The research on these phenomena is methodologically difficult. Case reports are prone to selection bias, and controlled experimental designs for intuitive connection between separated individuals are challenging to implement. But the accumulated anecdotal evidence from twin studies, combined with the experimental evidence from presentiment research and the cardiac intuition research from HeartMath, forms a pattern that cannot be dismissed as simple coincidence or wishful thinking. Something is happening that the conventional sensory framework does not explain, and the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Elaine Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger specifically for this work for establishing, through sustained and rigorous experimentation, that quantum non-locality is a genuine feature of physical reality rather than an artifact of specific experimental conditions. Quantum non-locality is not transmission of information through conventional channels. It is a structural feature of reality in which separated systems remain informationally linked in ways that transcend the classical notion of separation. If biological systems, the brain, the heart, the enteric nervous system involve quantum processes, then they may participate in non-local information connections that allow them to access information about events occurring at spatial distances that classical information channels could not bridge. The mother who wakes knowing something has happened to her son at the time it happens, across the distance that separates them, may be accessing information through a non-local connection that her biological systems are capable of detecting, but that her conscious mind cannot explain. The connection is not supernatural. It is physical, in the sense that it is grounded in the actual physics of the natural world. It is merely not classical, and therefore not accessible to the classical cognitive sciences that dismiss it as impossible. The orchestrated objective reduction theory we have encountered across these investigations provides a specific mechanism through which biological systems might participate in non-local quantum information. Penrose and Hameroff propose that quantum coherences in microtubules, the protein structures that make up the cytoskeleton of neurons, support brief episodes of quantum superposition that terminate in objective reduction events. During the coherence period, the quantum system has access to information that is not bound to the specific spatial and temporal location of the biological system. After the reduction event, the information becomes classical, localized, sequential, accessible to conscious awareness. In this framework, intuition is not a mysterious violation of physics. It is the biological registration of information that the quantum processing of the brain, heart, and gut has accessed during its coherence episodes, information that may come from spatial distances, future times, or other aspects of reality that classical information channels cannot reach. Anirban Bandyopadhyay's measurements of microtubule resonances support this interpretation by establishing that the microtubule quantum processes involve specific frequencies that are characteristic of the microtubule structure itself. Bandyopadhyay's research, conducted at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan, and subsequently at Navatar Bio, has identified specific resonance frequencies in the range of kilohertz to gigahertz that are characteristic of microtubule structures across species. The frequencies are not arbitrary artifacts of measurement. They emerge from the specific geometry and dynamics of the microtubule itself, its length, its diameter, the arrangement of its constituent tubulin proteins, and they produce specific electromagnetic signatures that can, in principle, couple with electromagnetic fields in the surrounding environment. These frequencies may serve as carriers of non-local information, specific frequency bands that the microtubule system uses to communicate with the broader informational field that the physics of non-locality suggests exists. If this interpretation is correct, then intuition is a form of tuning, the biological system tuning into the informational field that extends beyond the boundaries of the individual organism and that contains information relevant to the organism's situation. The intuitive knower is not receiving information through magic. They are receiving it through quantum biological processes that are physically real, and that, in principle, could be studied and understood by sufficiently sophisticated neuroscience. The HeartMath research on cardiac intuition connects directly to this framework. The heart's electromagnetic field extends several feet from the body, and the field can be measured at distances from the body's physical boundaries using standard instruments. The field carries information about the heart's state, and the information is detectable by other hearts in the vicinity. If the heart is an electromagnetic organ, capable of broadcasting and receiving information non-locally, then the heart may be one of the primary mechanisms through which intuitive information reaches conscious awareness. The heart tunes into the field. The field contains information. The heart's processing of the information produces the felt quality that consciousness registers as intuition. Roland McCraty's research at HeartMath has documented specific correlations between heart rate variability patterns and intuitive accuracy. Subjects who demonstrate greater heart rate variability coherence perform better on tasks that require intuitive judgment. Subjects whose heart rate variability is incoherent, whose cardiac rhythms are erratic and chaotic, perform worse on the same tasks. In one specific study, McCraty tested subjects on a task that required them to predict which of several images would appear next. The images were selected randomly, with no information available to the subjects that could have allowed conventional prediction. The subjects with the highest cardiac coherence measured through heart rate variability performed significantly above chance on the prediction task. The subjects with the lowest cardiac coherence performed at chance levels. The difference was not small. It was substantial enough to support the conclusion that cardiac coherence is a specific physiological condition that enables a cognitive capacity, the capacity to access information that is not available through conventional channels which the incoherent cardiac state does not permit. The cardiac coherence is not merely a physiological marker of overall health. It is a specific condition that correlates with the capacity for intuitive perception. The traditions have been emphasizing the heart as the organ of intuitive knowing for millennia. The HeartMath research provides a specific empirical foundation for what the traditions have been describing. The implicate order framework of David Bohm, which we have encountered across multiple investigations, provides a broader philosophical context for these findings. Bohm proposed that physical reality has two levels: the explicate order, which contains the distinct objects and events of ordinary perception, and the implicate order, which contains the undivided informational whole from which the explicate order unfolds. The implicate order is non-local in a deeper sense than quantum non-locality. It is not merely that separated systems can maintain informational connections across spatial distance. It is that the very distinction between separated systems is a feature of the explicate order rather than a feature of the implicate order. At the implicate level, all information is present, all times are present, all locations are present, folded together in a whole that the explicate unfolding articulates into the sequential, localized events that conscious awareness registers. If the implicate order is real, if reality has this deeper layer that the conventional physics of the explicate order does not capture, then intuition may be a form of access to the implicate order. Bohm's implicate order framework was developed not as a speculative philosophy but as a rigorous physical interpretation of quantum mechanics. Bohm had spent decades trying to understand quantum phenomena in ways that went beyond the operational formalism of the Copenhagen interpretation, and he eventually concluded that the strangeness of quantum behavior, the non-locality, the superposition, the role of measurement made sense only if physical reality had a deeper layer that the standard formalism did not describe. The explicate order, the world of distinct objects, discrete events, and localized properties, is a specific projection from the implicate order, much as a three-dimensional hologram is a projection from a two-dimensional interference pattern. The holographic analogy is not metaphorical for Bohm. It is literal. The explicate order is a holographic unfolding of the implicate order, and the non-local connections that quantum experiments reveal are the traces of the deeper holographic structure that produces them. The intuitive knower is not somehow transmitting information through classical channels. The reading is not conscious in the ordinary sense. The implicate order is not accessed through deliberate attention. It is accessed through receptive awareness, the quiet, still, attentive state in which the filter relaxes and the deeper information becomes available. The subjects do not experience the process as active investigation. They experience it as reception, the information arriving rather than being sought. And the information, when it arrives, does not appear as propositional content that the conscious mind can immediately articulate. It appears as the felt quality of knowing, the gut feeling, the hunch, the immediate conviction that arrives without explanation, but that carries with it an authority that the conscious mind finds difficult to dismiss. They are reading from the implicate order, directly perceiving informational content that is already present at the deeper level of reality, and that the explicate unfolding has not yet articulated into localized, sequential events. The presentiment that arrives seconds before the emotional image is not the body somehow perceiving the future. It is the body accessing information that is already present at the implicate level, information that will become an explicate event when the randomization algorithm selects the image, but that exists at the deeper level as potential, already prior to the selection. The philosopher Bernard Kastrup has developed this line of thinking into what he calls analytic idealism, the view that reality is fundamentally mental, that the implicate order is consciousness itself, and that individual minds are specific dissociated configurations within the universal consciousness. In Kastrup's framework, intuition is a form of partial de-dissociation, a momentary recognition of the informational connections that individual minds normally do not perceive, because the dissociation that constitutes individual identity obscures them. The intuitive knower is not violating the laws of physics. They are perceiving, for a moment, through a slightly less dissociated lens, registering information that is always present, but that ordinary perception filters out. Kastrup's framework is speculative, but it connects to a finding from the psychedelic research we have encountered in previous investigations. Robin Carhart Harris's work on psilocybin and other substances has documented that these substances reduce default mode network activity and produce experiences of expanded consciousness that often include intuitive knowings of information that subjects have had no conventional access to. The psychedelic research has documented specific experiences of intuitive knowing that subjects report during the psychedelic state. Subjects describe receiving information about their own lives, about other people, about metaphysical questions, about the nature of consciousness itself, information that arrives with a quality of certainty that ordinary consciousness rarely produces, and that often proves on subsequent investigation to be accurate. The phenomenon is not limited to subjective impressions. Some of the knowings provide specific information that the subject could not have obtained through conventional channels, and that is later verified. The phenomenon is difficult to study rigorously because the psychedelic state itself is subjective, and the verification of the knowings requires external corroboration. But the pattern is consistent enough across subjects and across studies to indicate that something is happening in the psychedelic state that the conventional neuroscience of these substances has not fully captured. The psychedelic state, in this framework, is a temporary reduction of the dissociation, that ordinary consciousness maintains a partial de-dissociation that provides temporary access to the broader informational field that the individual mind normally cannot reach. Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist whose work has been controversial, but whose experimental designs have been rigorous enough to warrant serious attention, has documented what he calls the sense of being stared at. In controlled experiments, subjects sit with their backs to another person and attempt to determine whether the other person is looking at them at specific moments. The experiments show a small but consistent effect. Subjects perform above chance at detecting when they are being observed. Even when the observer is behind a one-way mirror and no conventional sensory cues are available, the effect has been replicated across multiple laboratories and is difficult to explain through conventional mechanisms. Sheldrake interprets the phenomenon as evidence for what he calls morphic resonance, a form of non-local connection between living beings that operates through field effects that conventional physics does not yet describe. Whatever the correct interpretation, the phenomenon adds to the pattern of evidence suggesting that human perception is not confined to the conventional sensory channels, and that information about other minds reaches us through modes that classical science has not adequately mapped. The connections to the filter theory that has run through these investigations are immediate. If consciousness is fundamentally non-local, if individual minds are specific filtered expressions of a universal consciousness, then intuition is the moment when the filter momentarily relaxes. The filter is not removed entirely. That would dissolve the individual identity. But the filter relaxes just enough to allow specific information from the broader field to reach the individual consciousness. And the information arrives as intuition, not as conscious propositional content, but as a felt sense that the conscious mind registers without being able to articulate its source. The specific conditions under which intuition operates best are consistent with this framework. Intuitive accuracy improves when the conscious mind is relaxed, when the default mode network is quiet, when the heart rate variability is coherent, when the body is in a parasympathetic state of rest and digestion rather than a sympathetic state of fight and flight. Mindfulness research has documented the neural signature of these conditions with increasing precision. When the default mode network quiets, when the salience network downregulates, when the alpha rhythms of the brain become dominant over the beta rhythms of ordinary focus cognition, a specific neural state emerges that correlates with increased intuitive accuracy. The state is not the same as sleep. It is not the same as dissociation. It is a state of relaxed alert awareness, awake, receptive, present, but not engaged in the narrative self-construction that dominates ordinary consciousness. And the state is precisely what centuries of contemplative traditions have been trying to cultivate. The conditions are the conditions of reduced ego activity, reduced narrative self-construction, reduced cognitive noise, and the reduction of cognitive noise is precisely the condition that the filter framework would predict. When the filter activity is reduced, the broader information field becomes more accessible and the intuitive capacity expands. The contemplative traditions, which we will explore fully in the next part of this investigation, have been cultivating exactly these conditions for millennia. Meditation reduces default mode network activity. Prayer cultivates the parasympathetic state. Contemplation develops cardiac coherence. The practices developed by Christian mystics, Sufi masters, Buddhist monks, and Hindu sages were not arbitrary. They were technologies for accessing the intuitive capacity methods, for reducing the filter activity that ordinarily obscures the broader informational field, and for allowing the deeper knowing to reach the threshold of conscious awareness. The quantum framework suggests why these practices work. The practices do not produce intuition from nothing. They reduce the noise that ordinarily drowns out the subtle intuitive signal. They quiet the left hemisphere interpreter that interferes with the broader perception. They cultivate the cardiac coherence that allows the heart to function as an intuitive receiver. They develop the still, attentive, receptive state in which the filter relaxes and the deeper knowing becomes available. The distinction between intuitive knowing and ordinary thinking is phenomenologically significant. Ordinary thinking feels effortful, the mind working through options, weighing considerations, constructing arguments. Intuitive knowing feels given arriving complete, without effortful construction, with a quality of receiving rather than generating. The difference is not merely introspective. It corresponds to different neural signatures, different bodily states, and different cognitive outcomes. And the traditions have been describing this difference with extraordinary precision for thousands of years, noting that the intuitive capacity operates through different channels than the analytical capacity, and that the two capacities must be cultivated differently, recognized differently, and trusted differently. And the knowing that becomes available is not merely subjectively felt, it is often objectively accurate. Consider the range of documented phenomena that the quantum framework helps to contextualize. The firefighter who evacuates his crew moments before the floor collapses. The mother who wakes, knowing her son has been in an accident. The investor whose gut tells them to pull out of a position immediately before a market collapse. The scientist who sees, in a dream or a sudden insight, the solution to a problem that has resisted months of deliberate analysis. These are not random intuitions that occasionally prove correct through luck. They are functional perceptions, biological access to information that the individual could not have obtained through conventional channels, but that was nonetheless available through the broader informational field that the quantum physics of non-locality suggests permeates reality. The next part of this investigation will bring us into the traditions where the cultivation of intuition has been a central concern for thousands of years, where specific practices for developing intuitive capacity have been refined across generations, and where thousands of years of sustained contemplative practice have produced detailed maps of the territory that contemporary research is now beginning to explore. The Christian tradition in particular has developed an extraordinarily rich vocabulary for describing the varieties of intuitive knowing, the conditions that cultivate and corrupt it, and the practices that develop it into reliable spiritual capacity, where the phenomena that contemporary research is only beginning to document have been described with extraordinary precision. The connections between the physics and the traditions run in both directions. The physics suggests mechanisms that make sense of phenomena the traditions have described. The traditions provide experiential depth and methodological sophistication that the physics, by itself, does not possess. And the integration of the two perspectives with appropriate epistemic humility on both sides may be the most important development in the human understanding of consciousness since the ancient philosophical traditions first began to articulate what consciousness is and how it works. And the Christian tradition, with its rich vocabulary of discernment, its technologies for cultivating the spiritual senses, and its long history of mystical writings on the heart as the organ of deeper knowing, will lead the way. The Christian tradition has developed the most extensive vocabulary for intuitive knowing of any tradition in the Western world. The vocabulary is not incidental. It is the product of 2,000 years of sustained contemplative practice, centuries of men and women cultivating the capacity for direct, non-discursive knowing and developing. through the accumulation of their experiences, detailed descriptions of how intuition operates, how it can be distinguished from imagination or delusion, and how it can be reliably developed through specific practices. The vocabulary includes terms like discernment, the spiritual senses, the knowledge of the heart, the still small voice, the gift of counsel, the light of understanding, and many others, each term denoting a specific dimension of the intuitive capacity that the tradition has identified, studied, and cultivated with a precision that no purely secular framework has matched. The concept of discernment, diakrisis in Greek, discretio in Latin, is foundational. The term first appears in Paul's letters, where he identifies the diakrisis pneumaton, the discerning of spirits, as one of the spiritual gifts. The gift is the capacity to recognize, in one's own inner life and in the inner lives of others, which impulses come from the Holy Spirit, which come from the human self, and which come from sources of spiritual confusion or deception. The capacity is not reducible to analytical reasoning. The gift of counsel, one of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, identified in Isaiah and developed in later Christian tradition, is precisely the intuitive capacity to know the right course of action in specific situations, without having to reason through all the alternatives. The gift operates through a mode of cognition distinct from ordinary deliberation, and the tradition has treated it as a genuine perceptual capacity rather than as a metaphor for careful thinking. One cannot deduce through logic alone whether a particular impulse is trustworthy. The recognition arrives, in the Christian framework, through a specific spiritual sensitivity that must be cultivated through prayer, practice, and the accumulation of spiritual experience. The desert fathers and mothers of the 4th and 5th centuries developed discernment into a systematic practice. These figures, men and women who withdrew to the deserts of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine to devote themselves to contemplation, spent years in solitude, observing the movements of their own minds with the rigor of scientists studying a natural phenomenon. They identified specific patterns in the way thoughts arose, categorized them by source, some from God, some from the self, some from demonic influences, and developed practical guidance for how to distinguish between them. Their writings, collected in the Apophthegmata Patrum, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, constitute one of the most sophisticated bodies of introspective research ever produced, comparable in its precision to contemporary cognitive psychology, but with a spiritual orientation that cognitive psychology lacks. Evagrius of Pontus, a 4th century Egyptian monk who became one of the foundational figures of the contemplative tradition, identified 8 categories of thoughts, logismoi, that tempt the contemplative: gluttony, lust, avarice, anger, sadness, sloth, vainglory, and pride. These 8 logismoi would later become, through the work of John Cassian and Gregory the Great, the basis for the Western tradition's 7 deadly sins. But Evagrius's original concern was not primarily moral categorization. It was diagnostic. The contemplative needed to be able to recognize which thought was arising, understand its source, and respond appropriately. Evagrius's analysis went further. He identified the specific phenomenological signatures of each type of thought, the way gluttony thoughts arise with a specific quality of urgency and sensual focus, the way sadness thoughts arise with a specific quality of heaviness and collapsing inward, the way pride thoughts arise with a specific quality of expansion and self-importance. The trained contemplative, Evagrius argued, could recognize these signatures immediately, distinguishing one category of thought from another with the precision of a naturalist distinguishing species. And the recognition was essential for appropriate response. A gluttony thought called for one kind of spiritual response. A pride thought called for a completely different response. Without discernment, the contemplative would respond inappropriately and, through the inappropriate response, strengthen rather than weaken the patterns, the thoughts represented. The practice of discernment was, for Evagrius and his successors, a specific cognitive skill, a form of self-knowledge that enabled the contemplative to distinguish reliable inner guidance from unreliable inner noise. John Cassian, who brought the desert tradition into Western Europe in the early 5th century, systematized this methodology in his conferences, a series of recorded dialogues with desert monks that became required reading in Benedictine monasticism. Cassian's treatment of discernment, Conferences 2 and 9 in particular, presents it as the supreme monastic virtue, the capacity without which all other spiritual practices become dangerous. A monk without discernment, Cassian warns, may mistake delusion for divine guidance, mistake his own preferences for God's will, mistake the promptings of pride for the movements of humility. Only discernment can protect the contemplative from these errors, and discernment is cultivated through specific practices, sustained prayer, honest self-examination, guidance from a more experienced elder, the Abba or Amma, and the willingness to test every inner impression against the wisdom of the community. The medieval tradition developed this framework with increasing sophistication. Bonaventure, the 13th century Franciscan theologian, wrote extensively on what he called the spiritual senses, a set of interior faculties that parallel the 5 physical senses, but that operate on spiritual realities. The spiritual sense of sight perceives divine truths that the physical eye cannot see. The spiritual sense of hearing registers the still small voice of the Holy Spirit that the physical ear cannot hear. The spiritual sense of taste registers the sweetness of communion with God. The spiritual sense of touch registers the specific quality of spiritual realities that the body can only approximate. And the spiritual sense of smell registers the presence or absence of spiritual purity, an inner capacity that Bonaventure's treatment of the spiritual senses builds on earlier Christian writing, particularly the work of Origen in the 3rd century and Augustine in the 4th and 5th. Origen had proposed that the biblical references to seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching God should be interpreted as references to specific spiritual faculties, rather than as merely metaphorical uses of sensory language. Augustine had developed this framework in his own mystical writings, and Bonaventure brought the tradition to its most systematic expression. The spiritual senses are, in Bonaventure's framework, specific cognitive capacities that the soul possesses and that can be developed through contemplative practice. The tradition is often associated with discernment specifically, using olfactory metaphors, the odour of sanctity, the stench of deception, to describe the non-conceptual recognition of spiritual states. Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuit order in the 16th century, produced what is arguably the most practical and systematic methodology for the cultivation of discernment in the Christian tradition. His spiritual exercises, a 4-week program of intensive prayer and reflection that Jesuits have used for nearly 500 years, include specific rules for the discernment of spirits. The rules are phenomenologically precise. Ignatius describes specific kinds of interior movements: consolation, a sense of peace, joy, and drawing toward God, and desolation, a sense of heaviness, confusion, and drawing away from God, and provides detailed instructions for how to recognize each, how to respond to each, and how to distinguish the genuine movements of the spirit from the counterfeits that can simulate them. Ignatius's methodology anticipates with remarkable specificity what contemporary cognitive psychology has been rediscovering about intuitive decision-making. He insists that decisions should never be made during periods of desolation, during the anxious, confused, constricted states in which the mind cannot access its deeper resources. Decisions should be made during periods of consolation, during the peaceful, expanded, receptive states in which the inner guidance can be heard clearly. The recommendation parallels the HeartMath, finding that cardiac coherence correlates with intuitive accuracy. Intuition operates best when the body and mind are in specific physiological and emotional states, and those states can be recognized and cultivated deliberately. Ignatius did not know about heart rate variability, but the conditions he identified, peace, joy, receptivity, spaciousness, are precisely the conditions that contemporary research has identified as optimal for intuitive function. The Orthodox Christian tradition has developed discernment through a specific practice known as nepsis, vigilant watchfulness, cultivated most intensively within the hesychast tradition of Mount Athos. The hesychast, practicing the Jesus prayer with sustained attention over years and decades, develops a capacity to observe the movements of the heart with extraordinary clarity. Gregory Palamas, the 14th century Athonite theologian whose work we have encountered in multiple investigations, distinguished between the discursive mind dianoia and the spiritual intellect, nous, the nous, being the faculty capable of direct perception of spiritual realities, including the uncreated light that Palamas identified as the divine energies. The nous is not the same as discursive reasoning. It operates through a different mode of cognition, one that is available only when the dianoia has been quieted through sustained contemplative practice. The Philokalia, the 18th century compilation of Orthodox spiritual writings that has become one of the most important texts in Orthodox Christianity, contains detailed instructions for the cultivation of the nous. For the development of discernment, the Philokalia compiles writings from across Orthodox history, from the Desert Fathers of the 4th century through Byzantine theologians, Athonite monks, and later contemplatives, into a single systematic presentation of the tradition's accumulated wisdom on contemplative practice. The texts speak of the heart as the organ of spiritual perception, echoing the HeartMath research on cardiac intuition with remarkable phenomenological precision. The heart, in the Orthodox tradition, is not merely a biological pump. It is the spiritual center of the person, the place where prayer is made, where the Holy Spirit dwells, and where the direct perception of divine realities becomes possible. The practice is precise. The hesychast sits in a specific posture, head slightly bowed, eyes focused on the heart region, breath slowed. The Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, is repeated in synchronization with the breath. The attention is directed continuously to the heart, gradually descending from the head into the chest, producing what the tradition calls the union of mind and heart. The tradition is clear that this is not metaphorical. A specific experiential shift occurs when the practice is pursued long enough. The center of awareness relocates. The quality of thinking changes. The heart, previously experienced as a physiological organ with no particular cognitive significance, becomes experienced as the seat of awareness itself, the place from which perception arises, rather than a mere receiver of signals from a perceiving brain. The Orthodox practice of putting the mind into the heart, a specific technique associated with the Jesus prayer, is a method for relocating the center of cognition from the discursive brain to the perceptive heart, producing a mode of consciousness that the tradition describes as qualitatively different from ordinary mental activity. The heart, as the organ of intuitive knowing, is a theme that runs through Christian tradition from its earliest texts. The psalmist speaks of the secrets of the heart. Paul writes that the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God, and that believers know these depths through the Spirit dwelling in their hearts. Augustine, in his Confessions, addresses God directly as the one who dwells in the innermost place of my heart, the inner chamber, where the soul encounters the divine with a directness that discursive theology cannot approach. Meister Eckhart speaks of the spark of the soul, the innermost point of consciousness, where the divine presence is always accessible, where the ego's noise has not penetrated, and where direct knowing of God becomes possible. Teresa of Avila describes, in her interior castle, a journey through 7 successive mansions of the soul, with the innermost mansion containing the direct encounter with the divine beloved, a knowing that is not mediated through concepts, but that arises from the depths of the heart itself. Teresa's descriptions of the progressive mansions reveal the phenomenological precision that Christian mystics developed across centuries. In the early mansions, the soul is still largely occupied by ordinary thoughts, ordinary concerns, ordinary distractions. In the middle mansions, a capacity for deeper prayer emerges. The soul begins to experience periods of quiet, periods of specific felt recognition that something more is available than ordinary consciousness typically allows. In the advanced mansions, infused contemplation becomes possible, direct encounters with the divine that transform the soul without the mediation of concepts or images. Teresa describes each mansion with specificity, noting the characteristic experiences, the typical challenges, and the practical guidance appropriate at each level. The map is not a speculation. It is a record distilled from Teresa's own contemplative experience and from the experiences of the Carmelite nuns she directed, of what actually happens when the contemplative practice is sustained for sufficient time. John of the Cross, Teresa's contemporary and collaborator, wrote extensively on the specific kinds of intuitive knowing that arise during contemplative practice. In his Ascent of Mount Carmel and Dark Night of the Soul, John describes a progression in which the ordinary faculties of the soul are gradually quieted, the memory, the understanding, the will, so that a deeper faculty can operate. The deeper faculty is what John calls infused contemplation, a mode of knowing in which the soul receives knowledge directly, without the mediation of concepts, images, or sensory impressions. The knowing is certain, direct, and transformative. John's descriptions of infused contemplation are phenomenologically remarkable. He describes the soul at this stage as like a blank slate upon which the divine writes directly. The ordinary faculties, memory recalling the past, understanding, analyzing concepts, while deliberating about future actions, all of them must be suspended. And in their suspension, something else becomes possible. A knowing arrives that has not been constructed by any of the ordinary operations of the mind. The knowing is general rather than particular. John notes it does not typically convey specific propositional content. Tomorrow will bring rain, but rather a general orientation, a deeper understanding, a shift in the soul's relationship to reality. The specific propositional content that sometimes accompanies contemplative experiences is, John warns, often a product of the ordinary imagination rather than of genuine infused knowing, and the contemplative must learn to distinguish between them. It is not the product of the soul's activity. It is the result of divine activity operating within a soul that has been quieted sufficiently to receive it. The conditions that John specifies for the operation of infused contemplation parallel, with striking precision, the conditions that contemporary research has identified for optimal intuitive function. The mind must be quieted, the imagination must be released, the bodily senses must be recollected, the emotions must be stabilized. And into the stillness that results, a knowing arrives that the active, discursive, effortful operations of the ordinary mind cannot produce, and that once received, carries an authority that the ordinary mind can neither question nor duplicate. Buddhism approaches intuition through the concept of prajna, variously translated as wisdom, insight, or direct knowing. Prajna is one of the 6 paramitas, the perfections that the bodhisattva cultivates on the path toward enlightenment. But prajna is distinct from intellectual understanding jnana in a specific way. Prajna is the direct perception of reality as it is, unmediated by concepts, uncontaminated by the dualistic structures that ordinary thought imposes on experience. The Wisdom Sutras of Mahayana Buddhism, the Prajna Paramita literature describe prajna as the mother of all Buddhas, the fundamental faculty through which awakening becomes possible. The cultivation of prajna is the central concern of Buddhist contemplative practice. Vipassana meditation develops the capacity to perceive the arising and passing of mental events with precision, training the mind to recognize the subtle movements that ordinarily escape attention. Zen meditation cultivates the state of bare awareness, in which thought has been suspended and direct knowing can emerge. Hakuin Ekaku, the 18th century Japanese master who revived the Rinzai tradition, systematized koan practice into the methodology that remains standard today. The koan practice of Rinzai Zen uses paradoxical questions. What is the sound of one hand clapping? To push the rational mind beyond its usual operations, producing the sudden intuitive breakthrough that the tradition calls kensho or satori. The moment of satori is described, across the Zen tradition, in terms that closely parallel the Christian descriptions of infused contemplation. The ordinary mind is silenced, the conceptual structures dissolve, and a direct, immediate, undeniable knowing arises, a knowing that is not the product of reasoning, but that arises from a deeper level of consciousness that ordinary thought had been obscuring. The content of the knowing varies from practitioner to practitioner, but the phenomenology is consistent, direct perception, without mediation, carrying a quality of certainty that the ordinary mind cannot produce or refute. Dogen, the 13th century founder of Soto Zen, emphasized that prajna is not a separate faculty that operates occasionally. It is the fundamental nature of mind, always present but usually obscured. The practice of shikantaza, just sitting, is not a method for producing prajna. It is a method for removing the obstructions that prevent prajna from manifesting. The sitting is receptive rather than active. The mind is allowed to settle. The constant movement of thought is allowed to slow. And in the stillness that results, the prajna that was always present becomes available to ordinary awareness. Hinduism approaches intuition through a concept that extends even more deeply than the Buddhist prajna. The Sanskrit term is antarjnana, inner knowing, and the tradition places it at the center of the spiritual path. The Upanishads, composed between 800 and 200 BCE, repeatedly emphasize that the deepest truths cannot be learned through external instruction alone. They must be directly known through the cultivation of the inner faculty that perceives reality at its source. The Mundaka Upanishad states that Brahman cannot be known through the Vedas, through intellect, or through much learning. It can be known only by the one whom Brahman chooses, through a direct revelation that arises from within. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the foundational text of classical yoga, composed around 400 CE, describe the cultivation of intuition, pratibha, as one of the siddhis, the spiritual powers that emerge through sustained practice. Patanjali is careful about these powers. He warns that attachment to them can obstruct liberation, but he does not deny their reality. Patanjali identifies pratibha specifically in Book 3, Sutra 33, where he describes it as arising from the practice of samyama, the combined practice of concentration, meditation, and absorption on the inner light. The resulting capacity includes what Patanjali calls flashing forth, the spontaneous illumination of truths that the ordinary consciousness could not have reached through deliberate effort. The pratibha is specific and reliable. It is not a random occurrence of lucky guesses. It is a developed faculty that operates consistently once the requisite practice has been sustained for sufficient time. The cultivation of pratibha is a genuine consequence of sustained meditation, producing a capacity for direct knowing that operates independently of the ordinary senses and discursive mind. The modern Hindu tradition has continued to emphasize the development of inner knowing. Ramana Maharshi, the 20th century sage whom we have encountered in the identity investigation, pointed repeatedly to the heart as the seat of the true self, using the Sanskrit term hridaya in a sense that combines the physiological organ with its spiritual significance. The self is to be found, Ramana taught, through the inquiry that directs attention to the heart, not to the intellectual understanding, but to the heart's direct knowing. And the knowing that emerges from the heart in Ramana's teaching is not a new form of knowledge. It is the recognition of what the heart has always known, obscured only by the distracting activity of the mind. The Sufi tradition of Islam has developed the concept of intuitive knowing with particular sophistication. The Sufi masters speak of ilm al-qalb, knowledge of the heart, as distinct from, and in some respects superior to, ilm al-aql, knowledge of the intellect. The heart, in Sufi teaching, is not merely a metaphor. It is a specific spiritual organ, capable of perceiving realities that the intellect cannot reach. The cultivation of this organ is the central work of the Sufi path, pursued through specific practices: dhikr, remembrance of God; muraqabah, watchfulness; sama, spiritual audition, that refine the heart's capacity for direct knowing. Al-Ghazali, the 11th century philosopher who synthesized Sufi teaching with mainstream Islamic theology, described the heart's knowing as distinct in kind from the intellect's knowing. The intellect proceeds through steps from premises to conclusions, from evidence to inference. The heart knows directly, without steps, without mediation. The knowing of the heart is more reliable, al-Ghazali argued, than the knowing of the intellect, because it is closer to the source of knowledge itself, the divine reality that the heart is capable of perceiving when it has been sufficiently purified. Ibn Arabi, the greatest of the Sufi metaphysicians, developed this framework into an elaborate theology of the heart. The heart, in Ibn Arabi's teaching, has the capacity to receive the divine self-disclosures, tajalliyat, that manifest in different forms for different seekers at different moments. The reception is not passive. It requires cultivation. But when the heart has been properly prepared, it becomes a mirror in which the divine is reflected directly, producing a knowing that the ordinary intellectual operations cannot produce or verify. The practices that develop ilm al-qalb are specific. Dhikr, the rhythmic repetition of divine names, is practiced for hours at a time, sometimes with coordinated breath and body movements, sometimes in silent repetition. The practice gradually quiets the ordinary discursive mind and opens the heart to direct reception of spiritual realities. Muraqabah, contemplative watchfulness, cultivates the continuous awareness of the divine presence in all moments, training the heart to remain tuned to the subtle signals that the hurried mind ordinarily misses. And Sama, the spiritual audition that includes the whirling practice of the Mevlevi order, uses music and movement to produce specific states of consciousness in which the heart's capacity for direct knowing expands beyond its ordinary limits. The Mevlevi whirling, which we have encountered in the music investigation, is particularly illustrative. The practitioners spin for extended periods, one hand pointing up to receive divine grace and the other pointing down to transmit it to the earth. The rotation produces a specific altered state of consciousness. The vestibular system is overwhelmed, the ordinary spatial orientation dissolves, and the heart becomes available to experiences that the ordinary waking consciousness cannot access. The tradition insists that the whirling is not an ecstatic technique in any trivial sense. It is a contemplative practice with specific intentions, performed within a specific theological framework, producing specific kinds of spiritual knowing that the practitioners report with phenomenological consistency across generations. Rumi, Ibn Arabi's younger contemporary, expressed this framework in poetry of extraordinary beauty. Listen with the ear of your heart, Rumi writes. There is a voice that does not use words. Listen. The voice that does not use words is the voice that the intuitive faculty perceives directly. And the listening is not with the physical ear. It is with the heart, the organ of direct knowing that the Sufi tradition has been cultivating for 1,000 years. The Jewish tradition has developed its own vocabulary for intuitive knowing. The Talmudic concept of Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, refers to the divine inspiration that enables specific individuals to perceive truths that ordinary perception cannot reach. The prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible is grounded in this capacity. Abraham receives the divine communication directly. Moses speaks with God face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. The prophets receive the divine word in specific states of heightened receptivity that the tradition carefully distinguishes from mere imagination or wishful thinking. And the Hasidic tradition, beginning in the 18th century with the Baal Shem Tov, has developed specific practices for cultivating the state of devakut, cleaving to God, in which the ordinary separations between the individual mind and the divine source dissolve sufficiently to allow the divine presence to be perceived directly. The indigenous traditions of the world, Aboriginal, Australian, Native American, African, Siberian, Andean, share a fundamental commitment to intuitive knowing that the Western tradition largely abandoned. The shaman, across these traditions, is a specialist in direct knowing, trained through extensive initiation to receive information that is not available through conventional channels. The visions, the dreams, the felt sense of the situation, the subtle communications from animals, plants, and other non-human beings. All of these constitute a mode of knowledge that the indigenous traditions take as genuinely informative, not as superstitious fantasy. The research on indigenous knowledge systems, conducted by anthropologists and cognitive scientists including Eduardo Cohn at McGill and Tim Ingold at the University of Aberdeen, has documented the sophistication of indigenous epistemologies with increasing rigor. The methodologies for developing this capacity, the vision quests, the sweat lodges, the plant medicines, the ceremonial practices have been refined across many generations into sophisticated technologies for cultivating the intuitive faculty. The Taoist tradition approaches intuition through the concept of Ming clarity, illumination, the inner luminosity that perceives the Tao directly. The Zhuangzi describes the sage as one who has lost himself, who has released the ego's grip on experience sufficiently to allow the deeper perception to operate. The sage knows things without knowing how he knows them. The Taoist sage, in Zhuangzi's descriptions, lives in a state of continuous attunement with the natural flow. The sage does not plan extensively. The sage does not calculate. The sage perceives what the situation requires and responds directly, without the intervening layer of deliberation that ordinary consciousness inserts between perception and action. The butcher Ding, whose cutting of oxen we encountered in the non-human observer investigation, is a classical example. Ding does not think about where to cut. He perceives the natural structure of the ox, and his blade follows the openings that the structure provides. After decades of practice, the cutting has become effortless, performed with a single unified consciousness in which perception and action are not separated. He acts appropriately without deliberating about action. He reads situations without analyzing them. The capacity is what Zhuangzi calls wu wei, effortless action, and it is grounded in the intuitive perception that arises when the ego's interference has been removed. The convergence across traditions is striking. Different vocabulary, discernment, nous, prajna, antarjnana, al-qalb, Ming, but the same underlying claim. There is a faculty of direct knowing that operates differently from ordinary discursive thought that becomes available when the ordinary mind has been quieted, and that, when properly cultivated, delivers reliable information that the analytical mind cannot produce. Specific practices, systematic methodologies, phenomenological distinctions that no purely theoretical framework could produce. The traditions have developed specific practices for cultivating this faculty. The practices work. Practitioners who follow them develop capacities that untrained minds do not possess. Extended practice produces measurable changes. Extended practice enhances the capacity for direct perception. Extended practice corresponds to specific neural signatures that researchers can now measure, and the capacities, when examined from the outside, exhibit precisely the features that contemporary research on intuition has been rediscovering, not as miraculous interventions that violate the laws of nature, but as specific cognitive capacities that the human nervous system is capable of developing when the appropriate practices are sustained for sufficient time. The convergence is not an accident of cultural borrowing. The traditions developed independently in different parts of the world, at different times, in different languages, within different theological frameworks. The convergence in their descriptions of what intuition is, how it operates, and how it can be cultivated is the convergence of independent investigators studying the same phenomenon, the consistent finding across cultures that a specific cognitive capacity exists, that it can be developed through specific practices, and that it delivers information that the ordinary discursive mind cannot access on its own. The fourth part of this investigation will bring everything together: the neuroscience of the gut, the quantum physics of non-local information, the tradition's accumulated wisdom about the cultivation of inner knowing. And the result will be a picture of intuition as a genuine cognitive capacity, grounded in specific biological substrates, enabled by specific physical mechanisms, and cultivated by specific contemplative practices that humanity has been developing for thousands of years. The picture will change how you think about intuition. It may change how you live. 3 investigations, 3 independent approaches to a capacity that every human being has experienced, but that modern culture has systematically dismissed as unreliable, primitive, or superstitious. And the convergence among the neuroscience, the quantum physics, and the contemplative traditions produces a picture of intuition that is dramatically different from the picture that dominated 20th century thought. A picture in which intuition is not a relic to be overcome, but a sophisticated cognitive capacity that complements and in specific domains surpasses the capacities of deliberate analytical reasoning. The neuroscience established the biological substrate. The enteric nervous system contains 500 million neurons that process information, generate memory, and communicate with the brain through the vagus nerve in continuous bidirectional dialogue. The microbiome, 30 trillion bacterial cells inhabiting the gut, contributes its own informational signal to the cognitive ecology, influencing mood, cognition, and behavior through chemical communications that reach the brain through the same vagus pathway. The heart contains 40,000 neurons and generates an electromagnetic field that extends beyond the body and that carries information to and from other hearts in the vicinity. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex integrates bodily signals with cognitive deliberation through the somatic marker mechanism that Damasio documented. When you face a decision and feel a specific tightness in your chest, a specific settledness in your stomach, a specific lift or heaviness in your mood, these are not epiphenomenal feelings that your rational mind can safely ignore. They are communication summaries of extensive pre-conscious information processing, delivered to consciousness in the form that pre-conscious processing can produce. The rational mind that ignores them is operating without access to the data that its decision requires, providing the evaluative pre-conscious summaries that conscious reasoning depends on, but that consciousness does not generate. And the extensive pre-conscious processing of the brain, the 95% of cognitive activity that operates below the threshold of awareness, as the subconscious investigation established, generates continuously the intuitive outputs that consciousness registers as hunches, gut feelings, and immediate convictions. Intuition is not mysterious in its conventional operations. It is the product of extensive, sophisticated, embodied information processing that operates through specific biological substrates that contemporary research has mapped with increasing precision. The quantum physics established the framework for the phenomena that conventional neuroscience cannot explain. The presentiment experiments replicated across multiple laboratories have documented that physiological responses precede the stimuli that produce them by several seconds. The Global Consciousness Project's accumulated data suggests that collective intentional states correlate with measurable anomalies in random physical systems. The HeartMath research on cardiac intuition has established that heart rate variability coherence correlates with the capacity to predict information that could not be obtained through conventional sensory channels. Bell tests, Proietti's 2019 experiment, and the 2022 Nobel Prize awarded for the experimental establishment of quantum non-locality have confirmed that reality at its deepest level does not respect the localization assumptions that classical physics took for granted. Transactional interpretations of quantum mechanics, delayed choice experiments, and Orch-OR theory all suggest that biological systems may participate in non-local quantum processes that provide access to information beyond the spatial and temporal boundaries that classical biology identifies. The quantum framework does not prove that intuition involves non-local information, but it provides a coherent physical context in which such phenomena become possible to consider without requiring violations of the laws of nature. The traditions establish the experiential reality and the practical methodology. Christian discernment, Orthodox nous, Buddhist prajna, Hindu antajnana, Sufi al-qalb, Taoist Ming. These are not speculative terms. They are the product of thousands of years of contemplative practice, developed by men and women who devoted their lives to the cultivation of the intuitive capacity and who generated, through sustained practice, detailed phenomenological descriptions of what the capacity feels like, how it can be recognized, how it can be distinguished from imagination or delusion, and how it can be reliably developed. The practices work. They produce measurable changes in the nervous system, in cardiac coherence, in the default mode network. The changes correlate with the cognitive and experiential outcomes that the traditions have described. And the convergence across independent traditions, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, indigenous, on the same structural features of the intuitive capacity constitutes a form of cross-cultural corroboration that any serious inquiry into the phenomenon must acknowledge. Now, let us confront the objections. The first objection is the reductionist objection. The phenomena that appear to require non-local information access can be explained in their entirety by conventional mechanisms. The presentiment experiments may be artifacts of methodology, subtle cues in the experimental setup, statistical anomalies, or publication bias that combine to produce the appearance of an effect that does not actually exist. The HeartMath findings may be interpreted in terms of conventional physiology. Heart rate variability is correlated with health and cognitive function, and the apparent intuitive capacity may simply reflect the generally better cognitive performance of healthier subjects. The tradition's experiential reports may be interpreted in terms of psychology, self-suggestion, placebo effects, the social production of subjective experiences within communities that expect such experiences. None of the phenomena, the objection claims, actually requires anything beyond the conventional cognitive sciences. This objection has force, and it must be engaged. The methodological critiques of the presentiment research are real, and the field has had to work through several rounds of replication and refinement to address them. The statistical evidence, however, has held up under sustained scrutiny. Mossbridge's 2012 meta-analysis examined the studies with care, controlling for potential methodological issues, and found a robust effect that could not be explained by the critiques that had been raised. The effect size is small, but it is consistent, and it is statistically significant at a level that rules out chance as a full explanation. The reductionist objection, as applied to the presentiment research specifically, has not succeeded in eliminating the effect. It has only refined the conditions under which the effect must be acknowledged. The broader reductionist objection that all intuitive phenomena can be explained conventionally faces a deeper problem. The conventional explanation treats intuition as a product of pattern recognition, somatic integration, and pre-conscious processing. These mechanisms are real, and they account for many of the phenomena we call intuition. But they do not account for the cases where intuitive knowing delivers information that the intuitive knower could not have obtained through any prior experience, any subliminal perception, or any bodily integration of available cues. The mother who wakes at the moment her son has an accident thousands of miles away is not using pattern recognition. She has no prior experience of this specific event. She has no subliminal cues available to her at that distance. The phenomenon has been studied systematically where it can be. Russell Targ and Harold Putoff conducted remote viewing research at Stanford Research Institute in the 1970s under CIA funding, documenting that trained subjects could accurately describe distant locations they had never seen and had no information about. The research was controversial, the methodology was scrutinized, and skeptical critiques were offered. But the statistical evidence accumulated across multiple years of experiments was robust enough that the intelligence community continued to fund the work for decades. The research does not prove that remote viewing is a reliable operational capability, but it does provide additional pattern evidence that information access beyond conventional sensory channels occurs, that it is not uniformly distributed across individuals, and that it can, under specific conditions, be cultivated and deployed. Her bodily systems are not integrating information about the accident because no information about the accident has reached her body through any conventional channel. Something else is happening. And the reductionist framework, which excludes in principle the possibility that information could reach her through non-conventional channels, has no way to account for the phenomenon. The second objection is the unreliability objection. Even if intuition sometimes delivers accurate information, it often delivers inaccurate information. People have wrong hunches all the time. Gut feelings lead to bad decisions as often as good ones. And any capacity that produces correct results only some of the time cannot be treated as a reliable cognitive faculty. It is, at best, a source of guesses, some of which happen to be correct. This objection also has force, and the traditions themselves have taken it seriously. Ignatius's rules for the discernment of spirits are designed precisely to address the unreliability problem. Not every interior movement is trustworthy. Not every gut feeling is accurate. The cultivation of reliable intuition requires specific practices that quiet the ego, that develop cardiac coherence, that still the default mode network, that train the capacity to distinguish the genuine movements of the spirit from the counterfeits that can simulate them. The traditions are not naive about the unreliability of untrained intuition. They are sophisticated about it, developing methodologies that gradually refine the intuitive capacity from the unreliable guessing of ordinary consciousness to the trained perception of the contemplative practitioner. The unreliability of untrained intuition is not evidence against the reality of trained intuition. It is evidence for the importance of training. The contemporary research supports this. Klein's firefighters developed their pattern recognition through decades of experience, not through a few minutes of gut reaction. Davidson's meditators developed their specific cognitive capacities through thousands of hours of practice, not through wishful thinking. Gigerenz's heuristics work in specific environmental conditions that match the structure of the heuristics in other conditions. They fail. The skill of intuition, like every skill, must be developed, and the development requires sustained practice, honest self-examination, and the willingness to test one's intuitive impressions against reality. The third objection is the practical objection. Even if intuition is real, and even if it can be developed, the practical domains in which it operates reliably are limited. Intuition may work for firefighters in burning buildings, for chess grandmasters recognizing patterns, for physicians diagnosing familiar conditions. But for the complex, novel, high-stakes decisions that modern life increasingly requires major investment decisions, complex policy decisions, scientific research questions the domain of trained intuition is insufficient. These decisions require deliberate analysis, systematic data collection, and the careful integration of multiple sources of information. Intuition is a supplement, not a substitute, for the analytical capacities that modern civilization has developed. This objection is largely correct, and it is important to acknowledge. Intuition is not a universal replacement for analysis. The domains in which trained intuition reliably outperforms deliberate analysis are specific domains typically characterized by the availability of substantial embodied experience, by time pressure that prevents exhaustive deliberation, and by the presence of subtle cues that cannot be articulated but that pattern recognition systems can integrate. Outside these domains, deliberate analysis is typically more reliable. The sophistication lies in knowing which capacity is appropriate for which situation. High-speed pattern recognition for situations where extensive embodied experience is available, and time pressure prevents exhaustive deliberation. Deliberate analysis for novel situations where the patterns are unfamiliar and careful reasoning through alternatives is possible. Integrated judgment for situations that combine familiar and novel elements where neither pure intuition nor pure analysis is adequate on its own. And the sophisticated decision-maker uses both capacities, drawing on intuition when intuition is reliable, and on analysis when analysis is required, integrating the two in the complex judgments that consequential decisions demand. The traditions, in their most sophisticated forms, have always recognized this. The Christian discernment tradition insists on testing intuitive impressions against scripture, against the wisdom of the community, against the guidance of experienced spiritual directors. The Buddhist tradition insists on testing contemplative insights against the teachings of the Dharma and against the guidance of qualified teachers. The Sufi tradition insists on the guidance of a sheikh who can help distinguish genuine spiritual knowings from the projections of the nafs ego. The intuitive capacity is not a substitute for these checks. It is a source of material that the checks evaluate, refine, and integrate with the other sources of knowledge that a mature judgment requires. Now, let us trace the connections. The synchronicity investigation revealed that meaningful coincidences, causal correlations between inner states and outer events, challenge conventional understandings of causation. Intuition is the phenomenological experience of participating in this causal connection. The hunch that arrives just before the relevant event, the impulse that draws you toward the right place at the right time, the recognition that strikes when you encounter a significant person. These are synchronicity experienced from the inside, the felt quality of the non-local informational connections that the synchronicity research documents from the outside. The distance illusion investigation and the time investigations revealed that spatial and temporal localization are emergent rather than fundamental. If space emerges from quantum entanglement and time emerges from information processing, then the non-local access to information that intuition appears to demonstrate is consistent with the deep structure of reality rather than in violation of it. The intuitive knower is not reaching beyond the boundaries of space and time. The intuitive knower is perceiving the reality that underlies those boundaries, the reality that the localization of ordinary perception normally obscures. The observer effect, the quantum foundation of these investigations, provides the basic structure that makes intuition possible. The observer is not separate from the observed. Reality is not independent of perception. And if reality at its deepest level is a unified informational whole that unfolds into specific localized events through the measurement activity of conscious observers, then the access to information beyond the localized context of the individual observer is not mysterious. It is the background condition against which localized perception takes place. Intuition is the temporary relaxation of the localization, the momentary recognition of information from the broader field that the localized perception has not yet articulated into specific content. The heart investigation revealed that the heart is an intelligent organ with its own neurons, its own electromagnetic field, and its own capacity for information processing. The intuition investigation extends this. The heart is specifically the organ of intuitive perception. HeartMath research has documented cardiac responses to upcoming emotional stimuli, the correlation of cardiac coherence with intuitive accuracy, and the role of the electromagnetic field in the transmission of information between individuals. The Orthodox hesychast who cultivates the union of mind and heart is not engaging in a quaint spiritual practice with no physical significance. The practitioner is cultivating the integration of cardiac and cerebral information processing that contemporary research has independently identified as essential for intuitive function. The placebo investigation demonstrated that belief creates biology. The intuition investigation adds, intuition depends on the biological states that belief helps to create. The meditator who trusts that sustained practice will develop intuitive capacity enters the practice with a physiological orientation that enables the capacity to develop. The skeptic who dismisses intuition as superstition maintains a physiological orientation that suppresses the capacity. The self-fulfilling nature of these orientations is not evidence that intuition is merely belief. It is evidence that belief and biology are integrated, that the conditions of biology include belief as one of the factors that shape them, and that the cultivation of intuitive capacity requires the cultivation of the beliefs that enable the biological states that support the capacity. The free will investigation revealed that Process 1, the conscious selection of templates from quantum superpositions, is the mechanism of conscious choice. Intuition may be Process 1, operating pre-reflectively. The intuitive knower selects a template from the field of possibilities without the deliberate weighing of alternatives that characterizes conscious deliberation. The template arrives as hunch, as gut feeling, as immediate knowing, and the knower either accepts or rejects it. The acceptance is a conscious act, but the production of the template is pre-conscious, arising from the deeper integrative processes that Process 1 enables. Intuition, in this framework, is not less conscious than deliberation. It is consciousness operating at a different level, selecting from the deep informational field rather than from the conscious articulation of alternatives that deliberate analysis produces. The fear investigation demonstrated that chronic fear degrades the physiological conditions that support optimal cognitive function. Intuition, specifically, is degraded by fear. The anxious mind cannot hear the still small voice. The fight or flight state cannot access the subtle cues that intuitive perception depends on. The contemplative traditions have always insisted that the cultivation of intuitive capacity requires the cultivation of interior peace, not as a spiritual luxury, but as a cognitive precondition. This is why chronic anxiety disorders impair not just emotional well-being but the full range of cognitive capacities. The anxious mind cannot think clearly, cannot perceive subtly, cannot access the deep intuitive resources that the unfearful mind has available. And this is why the treatment of anxiety must address not only its cognitive manifestations, but its physiological ones, because the physiology is the substrate on which the capacity for clear perception depends. The research supports this: cardiac coherence, reduced default mode activity, parasympathetic dominance. The specific physiological signatures of intuitive accuracy are the signatures of the state that fear disrupts and that peace enables. The subconscious investigation revealed that 95% of cognitive processing occurs below the threshold of conscious awareness. Intuition is the voice of this processing. The subconscious integrates vast amounts of information from the body's sensory systems, from the gut and heart, from the long-term memory, from the pattern recognition systems that have been shaped by a lifetime of experience. And the subconscious delivers its summary verdicts to consciousness, not as propositional content, but as felt senses, the gut feelings, the hunches, the immediate convictions that arrive without explanation, but that carry the integrated wisdom of the subconscious processing. The karma investigation revealed that intentional actions leave traces that affect future circumstances. Intuition may be one of the channels through which these traces operate. The good you have done becomes, over time, a deepening of the capacity for wise perception. The attention you have cultivated becomes a refined sensitivity to subtle signals. The practices you have undertaken become biological and neural configurations that enable specific kinds of knowing. Every act of attention, every act of discipline, every act of sustained practice leaves traces in the nervous system and in the broader informational field that the tradition calls karma. The karma of intuition is not mystical. It is the cumulative effect of the practices and attentions that shape the nervous system over time, producing the capacity for the refined perception that the untrained nervous system cannot achieve. The music investigation revealed that specific frequencies produce specific states of consciousness. The practices that cultivate intuition often involve specific acoustic or rhythmic elements: the chanting of the hesychast, the dhikr of the Sufi, the mantra of the Hindu, the drumming of the indigenous shaman. These elements are not incidental. They are technologies for producing the physiological and neural states in which intuitive perception becomes available. The music investigation and the intuition investigation point toward the same conclusion. Sound, rhythm, and vibration are not merely aesthetic or recreational phenomena. They are cognitive technologies that can produce specific states of consciousness that support specific cognitive capacities. The OBE investigation demonstrated that consciousness may not be confined to the body. The intuition investigation extends this. Intuitive information may arrive from beyond the body's immediate spatial location. If consciousness is fundamentally non-local, then the body's perceptual apparatus is not the only source of information available to the conscious mind. The intuitive knower may be receiving information through the non-local connections that the OBE research suggests are available to consciousness when the usual localization mechanisms are relaxed. The information investigation established that reality is fundamentally informational rather than material. If this is correct, then the informational field that underlies physical reality is the true medium of intuition. The intuitive knower is not receiving impossible information. They are receiving information that is already present in the informational substrate of reality, and that becomes accessible when the specific conditions that enable intuitive perception are in place. The lucid dreaming investigation revealed that consciousness can be aware within a reality it recognizes as a construction. Intuition may be the waking life analog of lucid dreaming, the capacity to perceive reality with the awareness that the specific, localized perceptions of ordinary consciousness are themselves constructions and that the deeper informational field is accessible through the relaxation of the construction. The lucid dreamer in the dream and the intuitive knower in waking life are engaging similar capacities through different modalities. The immortality investigation revealed that aging is information loss. The intuition investigation adds, the cultivation of intuition may be one path toward the preservation of information integrity. The practices that cultivate intuitive capacity, meditation, prayer, contemplation, also reduce the chronic stress that accelerates aging, stabilize the cardiac coherence that correlates with longevity, and quiet the default mode network that consumes disproportionate metabolic resources. This connection may be one of the most practically significant findings to emerge from the integration of the investigations. The cultivation of intuition is not a separate project from the cultivation of longevity, or from the cultivation of cognitive function, or from the cultivation of emotional well-being. They are the same project, the project of developing the physiological conditions in which the nervous system operates at its highest capacity. The contemplative path is not merely a spiritual discipline. It is a biological intervention that affects the processes of aging, cognitive function, and the integrity of the information that constitutes the self. The creativity investigation revealed that genuine creative insights arrive from beyond the individual mind. Intuition is the general capacity that creative insight specifically expresses. The creative genius is an intuitive genius capable of perceiving information from the implicate order, from the quantum vacuum, from the collective unconscious, and translating it into specific creative products. Tesla's visions of completed inventions, Kekule's dream of the benzene ring's snake biting its tail, Ramanujan's attribution of his mathematical theorems to the goddess Namagiri, all of these involve the same phenomenology: information arriving, unsought, through channels that are not the channels of deliberate analysis. The practices that cultivate intuition are the same practices that cultivate creativity. The states that enable intuitive perception are the states that enable creative reception. Intuition and creativity are not separate capacities. They are the same capacity operating in different domains. The identity investigation revealed that you are not your thoughts, but the awareness in which thoughts appear. Intuition is the voice of that deeper awareness, the direct knowing that arises from the ground beneath the constructed narrative self. The narrative self cannot produce intuition, because the narrative self is itself a construction. The awareness that underlies the narrative self, the awareness that remains when the narrative is quieted, is the source of intuition. The practices that develop intuition are practices that develop contact with the deeper self. The analytical mind, absorbed in its own narratives and its own constructions, does not easily perceive this deeper self. But when the analytical mind quiets, when the narrative self recedes, when the continuous self-referential processing of the default mode network relaxes, something else becomes available. A quieter knowing, a deeper perception, a directness of contact with reality that the constructions had been obscuring, and the cultivation of intuition is, in this sense, the cultivation of contact with the deeper self that the narrative self usually obscures. The biological antenna investigation proposed that living systems may function as receivers of non-local quantum information. Intuition is what reception feels like from the inside. The cryptochrome in the bird's eye, the microtubule in the human neuron, the coherent quantum processes in the photosynthetic apparatus, these are not merely biochemical mechanisms. They are antennae, tuning into the informational field that pervades reality, translating non-local information into the localized signals that the conscious nervous system can process. The intuitive capacity of humans is the human version of what migratory birds do when they navigate by magnetic field information, and what plants do when they orient toward optimal energy resources. Life is an information-receiving phenomenon, and intuition is the human experience of that reception. The Boltzmann brain investigation revealed that the awareness does not depend on the specific history of the body. The intuition investigation confirms, intuition is not the product of the body's specific history. It is the access of the awareness to the informational field that extends beyond the body's specific location and the specific timeline of its conscious experience. The Boltzmann brain, if it existed, might have intuitions about a universe it never inhabited, about events that never occurred, about meanings that were never constructed, and the intuitions would be as real, experientially, as the intuitions of the biologically evolved brain that has a genuine causal history. The non-human observer investigation revealed that consciousness is widely distributed across the biological world. Intuition may be widely distributed too. Animals exhibit intuitive capacities, the migrating bird that navigates without maps, the dog that senses its owner's return, the elephant that perceives the approach of rain from hundreds of miles away. These capacities are not limited to sophisticated cognition. They are features of conscious beings more broadly, and the mechanisms that support them in non-human species are continuous with the mechanisms that support them in us. Every thread connects. Every investigation deepens the picture, and the practical consequences are immediate and significant. You have an intuitive capacity. Every human being has this capacity. It is grounded in specific biological substrates that contemporary research has mapped with increasing precision. It is enabled by specific physical mechanisms that the quantum framework has illuminated, and it has been cultivated across human history by specific contemplative practices that produce measurable changes in the nervous system and that correlate with the phenomenological experiences the traditions have described. The cultivation of intuition is available to you. The practices are known. They work. They produce specific changes in cardiac coherence, in default mode network activity, in neural connectivity, in the physiological conditions that enable intuitive function. The changes can be measured. The effects can be verified. And the capacity that results is not a speculative spiritual gift reserved for a rare elite. It is a specific cognitive capacity that the human nervous system is capable of developing when the appropriate conditions are maintained long enough. The contemplative traditions have been arguing across their different vocabularies that the cultivation requires specific disciplines practiced with specific regularity over specific time frames. The Jesuit novice spends years in the spiritual exercises. The Zen monk spends decades in the meditation hall. The Sufi initiate apprentices to a master for a lifetime. The commitment is not optional. The capacity that these traditions produce cannot be developed through weekend workshops or quick techniques. It requires sustained practice, the kind of practice that shapes the nervous system over years, that deepens the cardiac coherence over thousands of hours, that reduces the default mode activity through the cumulative effect of sustained silent attention. The practice is simple in its basic form. Sit. Quiet the discursive mind. Bring attention to the heart. Breathe slowly. Let the narrative self recede. Observe what arises without grasping or pushing away. The specific practice can take many forms. The Christian centering prayer involves the gentle return of attention to a sacred word whenever thoughts arise. The Buddhist breath meditation involves the continuous return of attention to the sensation of breathing. The Sufi dhikr involves the rhythmic repetition of divine names. The Hindu mantra practice involves the sustained internal recitation of a specific sound or phrase. All of them share a common structure: sustained, gentle, non-grasping attention directed away from the discursive mind and toward a focus that does not sustain discursive thought. Do this for 20 minutes a day, every day, for years. The capacity will develop, the phenomenology will become familiar, the reliability will increase, and the life you live will be shaped, increasingly, by the deeper knowing that the practice makes accessible. You do not need to believe any particular theology to engage the practice. The practice produces the physiological conditions regardless of the theological framework in which it is embedded. The Christian contemplative and the Buddhist meditator and the secular mindfulness practitioner are producing the same cardiac coherence, the same default mode reduction, the same physiological signatures of intuitive readiness. The universality of the physiological response is one of the most significant findings of contemporary contemplative neuroscience. The conditions are not specific to any one religion or culture. They are specific to certain practices that can be extracted from their theological frameworks and practiced within other frameworks or within no framework at all, and that still produce the same physiological effects. The Christian centering prayer and the Buddhist vipassana and the secular mindfulness meditation all produce substantially similar changes in the brain and body, though they occur within different interpretive frameworks. The theology shapes the interpretation of the experiences. The physiology produces the experiences. The practices produce measurable effects across decades, and the effects compound. The meditator of 10 years has capacities that the meditator of 1 year does not have. The meditator of 30 years has capacities that the meditator of 10 years does not have. The compound interest of sustained practice produces, over a lifetime, cognitive and experiential capacities that no short-term intervention can match. And the experiences are worth having, the gut feeling that saves your life when you pay attention to it. The hunch that leads you to the right decision when analysis cannot resolve the alternatives. The sense of another person's state that allows you to respond appropriately to their unspoken needs. The immediate recognition of truth or falsehood in situations that the deliberate mind has not yet passed. These are not superstitious consolations. They are the operations of a cognitive capacity that has been waiting for you to develop it. Consider what this capacity has already done in your life. Consider the moments when you knew before you knew how. Consider the decisions you made against analytical advice that turned out to be right. Consider the people you recognized as trustworthy or untrustworthy on first meeting before any evidence could justify the recognition. Consider the times you felt drawn toward a particular path and found, in following it, that the path led somewhere significant. These were not random hunches. Every human being has stories like this. The specifics vary. The pattern is universal. Intuition is not rare. Intuition is everywhere, operating continuously, below the threshold of awareness, delivering its summary verdicts whether or not the conscious mind pays attention to them. The question is not whether you have the capacity. You have had it since you were born. You had it before your culture taught you to distrust it. You had it before your education replaced it with analytical methodologies that, however valuable in their domains, are insufficient for the full range of situations life presents. You have it. The question is whether you will develop it, trust it, and integrate it with the analytical capacities that modern life also requires. These were operations of the capacity that contemporary research is now documenting and that the traditions have been cultivating for millennia. The gut feeling you ignored last week, you were right to feel it. The hunch you followed against advice, you were right to follow it. The sense that something was wrong with a relationship before anything visible had gone wrong, you were perceiving accurately. And the capacity can be cultivated. The traditions have shown the way. The science has begun to map the territory. The choice of whether to develop the capacity is yours. Your body knows. Your heart knows. Your gut knows. The deeper awareness beneath the narrative self knows. The voice is speaking. It has always been speaking. And the capacity that answers when you listen, the deeper knowing that arrives through channels that conventional epistemology cannot map, but that traditions have been cultivating for millennia, is not separate from who you are. It is you, in a deeper sense than the narrative self and the discursive intellect usually allow, the awareness that perceives without conceptual mediation, the heart that knows without deliberate analysis, the ground of being that recognizes truth immediately when truth appears. It has never failed you when you have trusted it. It has only failed you when you have ignored it, when you have overridden it, when you have prioritized the analytical mind's more persuasive-sounding arguments over the heart's quieter but more reliable knowing. It has been with you all along. The question is whether you will learn to listen.